So on behalf of the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures at the University of Virginia, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our book seminar series. I'm Debjani Ganguly, the director of the Institute. Today we host two historians, Professors Prathama Banerjee and Rochona Majumdar, whose impressive writings on South Asian cultural history, political theory, postcoloniality, and cinema have greatly enriched the ever-widening sphere of what we call the global humanities. Over the past decade, our institute has served as an experimental space to explore the complex relationship between what we, especially in universities in the West, call the traditional humanities as distinguished from area studies. The increasing overlap and mutual articulations between the two in recent decades have played no small part in the emergence of a global humanities, and especially the rubric Global South, as a disordering episteme that exists at the confluence of and tensions between various systems of knowledge and ways of conceptualizing space, habitations, cultures, aesthetics, and political economy. South Asia was an important region for theorizations of postcolonial temporalities in the 1980s and 90s, whether through the discourse of alternative modernities, subalternity, or hybridity, or by provincializing discourses of normative modernity inhering in European political philosophy. What happens when we move away from theories of postcolonial difference and instead excavate the internal heterogeneity of large concepts like ideology, self, political action, people, labor, and historicality in various expressive, analytic, imagistic, and performative modes emerging from particular regions, say South Asia in the case of our speakers today? This is the exciting work that Prathama Banerjee and Rochona Majumdar undertake in their new books. Prathama is Professor of History and Political Thought at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, India, and the author of Politics of Time, Primitives, and History Writing in a Colonial Society. She will be sharing insights from her latest book, Elementary Aspects of the Political, Histories from the Global South. Rochona Majumdar is Associate Professor in the Departments of South Asian Languages and Civilizations and Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago, and the author of Marriage and Modernity and Writing Postcolonial History. She will be talking about her latest book, Art, Cinema, and India's Forgotten Futures, just out from Columbia University Press. My friends and I saw politics as the default condition of being, writes Prathama, describing her coming of age in India during the later decades of the 20th century. The political, she writes, saturated their daily life in every sphere. In her quest to trace histories of this political, Prathama distills four labor and use them with ethical, archival, and historical texture, ranging from pre-colonial Indic traditions to Islamic and European modes of thought. She excavates what she calls multiple propensities and potentialities of these elements, and in the process raises several important questions for us to ponder. What happens when we turn specific historical events into universal philosophical archetypes? What is gained and lost in such enterprise? How might one undertake, in her words, the experimental task of assembling a history of the political from the global South in a mode of creative play that goes beyond postcolonial and decolonial critique? Rochona Majumdar similarly channels the creative energy of what we might call the post-subaltern studies, post-colonial theory moment in South Asian intellectual history. Her book traces India's post-colonial history and the unraveling of its progressive aspirations through the medium of art cinema that flourished from the 1950s to the 1970s. Art cinema becomes in her deft hands at once a mode of doing history, a global art form, and an aesthetic riposte to the unraveling of post-colonial nation building. Together, Prathama and Rochona's books interrogate what the stakes of the philosophical, the aesthetic, the literary, and the cinematic are to practicing historians and political theorists. They also raise important questions about the limits and possibilities of conventional, discipline-based archival work in tracing the historicality of our global present. The luminous interdisciplinarity of their projects is a model of creative scholarship, engaging, exciting, and studded with brilliant insights. Here is how our seminar today will proceed. We will begin with Prathama Banerjee and Rochona Majumdar sharing insights from their books. Their presentations will be followed by a conversation with our discussants, our UVA colleagues, Aswin Punathambekar, Associate Professor of Media Studies, and Samhita Sunya, Assistant Professor in the Department of Middle East and South Asian Languages and Cultures and Transregional Cinema. We'll take questions and comments from the audience both during this conversation and after it. So do post your thoughts in the chat and the Q&A boxes. I now have the pleasure of inviting Prathama Banerjee to talk about her book.
Thank you very much, Debjani, Aswin, Samhita, for your attentive reading of our books. This is a very precious moment with old friends and new, and in an institution where I have visited earlier and has had really nice memories of. So thank you very much. So here goes. So Mine at Heart is a very simple book. It studies the rise of modern politics in India between the mid-19th and the mid-20th century, with a view to rethinking what we today know as the political. It comes out of our concern, yours and mine, with the current political condition of the planet, which has put under question entrenched political concepts and ideals, be it democracy, equality, community, indeed the human itself. This book offers one possible approach to our contemporary political predicament, which is to go back to the beginning, as it were, and rewrite the genealogies of our modern day political grammar, which I suggest is best done from a counter location, in my case, Bengal and South Asia, but it could well be Black America or the Maghreb or Haiti, erstwhile colonies which best expose the chinks in the armor of hegemonic European political philosophy. So following modern common sense, which assumes that politics has to do with either political subjectivity or political community or political action or political ideology, I begin my book by disassembling the political into what I call, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, its elementary aspects, namely self, people, action, and idea. Then I set out to historicize each of these elements by analyzing the complex processes that go into the making of practices that we today recognize as decidedly political. So asceticism, realpolitik, sacrifice, martyrdom, hunger strike, labor strike, struggle, party, vanguard, crowd, representation, realism, and so on and so forth. I show through this history how each element of the political is actually queered by an irresolute historical instability, even split at its very heart. Which is why I analyze each element in two contrasting chapters, paired together to highlight the tension, the untenability that renders its apparent elementary status unviable. So I show that the modern political subject is always already split by the tension between renunciation and realpolitik, the one having to do with religion and spirituality, the other with philosophy and drama. Action implodes over the tension between two contrary orientations, selfless action, nishkama karma, and labor with their contrasting means-end configurations. The political idea is torn between its troubled relationships with the mundane and the supramundane, the economic and the religious, and the people forever oscillates between being pure structure, as in the political party, which I argue actually makes the nation form thinkable in the first place, and pure fiction, which I argue is a matter of aesthetics and futurity rather than culture and history. So if the modern political, by virtue of its historically untenable elements, is an unstable formation, always already teetering at the edge where subject, people, idea, and act disassemble into irresolute binaries and impossible choices, how does the modern political function in the first place? My answer is that modern politics operates not on the basis of any autonomous, irreducible principle, which is a priori recognizable as political, but through a disciplinary differentiation of the political from the non-political. Now, this might sound a little bit counterintuitive, because in modern times, we are used to thinking that everything is political. However, I try to show in my book that the becoming political of any act, entity, idea, or image is actually at any one time the unfolding of a certain political, non-political dialectic. So, for instance, the non-political could at times be indexed as the religious, as in so much of political studies, the sexual, the social, the artistic, the economic, and the scientific. As we know very well, the 18th, 19th century imagination of modern politics proposed that political logic was autonomous of religious, Max Weber, social, Thomas Hobbes, economic, Adam Smith, aesthetic, Immanuel Kant, and other such supposedly non-political logics. And subsequently, 20th century critics demonstrated that each of these so-called non-political logics was no less shot through with the political than politics itself. So feminists politicize the intimate, Marxists politicize the economic, and so on and so forth. We seem to be therefore caught up in a spiral. We define the political in opposition to a certain non-political imperative only to show up the non-political as political after all. I see this as the persistent political, non-political dynamic through which modern thought works, reproducing the political itself as a self-evident and universal concept which actively resists, by virtue of its axiomatic nature, any fundamental rethinking. I then go on to contrast the non-political to what I call the extra-political. The non-political in my telling is that which makes possible a disciplinary delimitation of the political in modernity. So, for example, in the discipline of economics, the assumed autotelic domain of the market is the so-called non-political, which conceptually delimits the domains of the state, law, and labor. The extra-political, on the other hand, is that which resists and refuses a ready political resolution. and therefore denotes the imperative that threatens to implode politics as we know it. Take, for example, the planetary and the cosmological, which have forced us today to ask, how does a politics of justice look when we factor the non-human in the story? Be it a god or a virus or a machine. The extra-political, in this sense, indexes the limit, even the possible exhaustion of the political, and therefore forces us to ask the unthinkable question: if not politics, then what? At the same time, however, the extra-political often also makes possible incredible political and ethical risk-taking, which is why the most interesting political figures of India, be it a Gandhi or a Tagore or an Ambedkar or an Iqbal, all of whom have been accused at times of not being adequately political, are marked by a certain surplus in their lives and thought, which is irreducible to the political principle. Call it by whatever name: the spiritual, the sexual, the poetic, the existential, or even the ecstatic. Finally, a quick word about political philosophy. While this book may appear to be as much a work of political philosophy as it is of history, it is actually driven by a critique of philosophy. Philosophy as that traditional meta-discipline, primarily European in its provenance, which claims to explain politics better than any other form of thought in the world. In India, and most likely in other post-colonies, we remain caught up in a curious double bind. We believe that we are an intensely political people, and yet we seem to lack political philosophy. We compensate by either borrowing concepts from Western European political philosophy or by simply critiquing their Eurocentrism. But we do not ask questions of the epistemological formation called philosophy itself, nor interrogate philosophy's claim of a privileged access to politics. Which is why in my book, I try to resist political philosophy's hegemonic claim over political language and show up philosophy as merely one of many players, even a besieged player in the field of politics. And I bring into play other modes of thought and expression, and indeed feeling, literature, drama, visuals, to show that thought can be embodied in diverse forms, of which philosophical is only one. So I suggest that in questioning the self-evidence of the political, we must also redefine what we call the philosophical. And more importantly, we must creatively play with different possible relationships between the philosophical and the historical, or the conceptual and the empirical. So I do not spend much time in this book in trying to show how modern political concepts pitched as universal, are however unhelpful to the study of non-European contexts, because post-colonial and decolonial scholars have done this exercise already effectively. Instead, I suggest that it is now time to move on from the task of critique and undertake the more positive task of imagining other possible formations and embodiments of the political from out of other archives, other histories, other languages, and other regions. Hence, the gesture towards the global South in the title of the book, which I should clarify I see as a geopolitical non-place, as an intellectual site more than anything else, where scholars of different regions and languages can virtually collaborate to rethink politics and the political, not just for themselves and their regions, but for the world at large. In the process, also hopefully becoming free and equal theoretical subjects of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Prathama. There's so much to think about, talk about, and even invite you to share very specific archives, examples, from a range of a body of work that from pre-modern times to our and the methodologically, it's just totally fascinating how you generate that synthesis. So much to talk about. But I now have the pleasure of inviting Rochona Majumdar to share insights from her book, after which we will open the seminar up for conversation with our discussants. Rochona.
Thank you, Debjani. I hope my sound is not too, that I'm not breaking up too much. I was having some trouble hearing Prathama, so I hope the technology works. So my deepest thanks first to Debjani, to Aswin and Samhita for engaging the book. And I want to say what an honor it is to actually be sharing this same platform with Prathama, with whose recent book, The Elementary Aspects of the Political, I've actually spent a good part of last year. I've read it, I've written about it. It's a book I deeply, deeply admire. So I'm very honored to be here. As I was thinking about your invitation, Debjani, and how to present certain insights from the book, I thought the place where I would begin is actually its title, and consider really the art cinema and India's forgotten futures bit. And, it's been a while since I wrote it, but I wanted to go back to this question and ask, why forgotten futures? I mean, what was at stake in saying that these futures are forgotten, and what might that tell us about history? Now, the first thing I should say is that with the term forgotten futures, this was also my way of acknowledging my debt to the new film history, which was pioneered in the department that I work in at the University of Chicago by the likes of Tom Gunning, Miriam Hansen, Yuri Sivian. I mean, those of you who are media scholars know that that film history was very critical of a linear narrative of the cinematic arts. In other words, Tom and Miriam and other folks call into question that you could actually write about cinema sort of starting maybe with the magic lantern and then moving to the philosophical and visual toys of the 19th century, then to still photography, then on to what sort of short films, the Méliès, Lumière films, and then sort of arrive at modernity with narrative cinema. And the term forgotten film future actually occurs in one of Gunning's essays that was written in the centenary of cinema. And I wanted to acknowledge my debt to that critique of linearity. Even though I don't actually speak about the medium as such, but the critique of linearity is something that I take and take very seriously in the way in which I think about art cinema's relationship with modernization and development. And of course, I mean, that new film history has a robust life in South Asian film studies. I mean, I'm thinking of Sudhir Mahadevan's very, very important book where he illustrates beautifully that something like obsolescence makes no sense when you're looking at cinecultures in South Asia. So that was one of the ways, in other words, The Forgotten Futures was a gesture into thinking about temporality for me. And it got me into the book's project of thinking about the relationship between cinema and when I say cinema, I of course mean a very large constellation of things that includes films, that includes organizing around films, cine clubs, theatrical and non-theatrical screenings, debates, institutions. So it's a whole corpus of things. So reconfiguring the relationship between that discursive apparatus and temporality. So that's the first task that the book undertakes, thinking about cinema's relationship to post-colonial space and time. The second thing is more straightforwardly historical in that, and this is something I do in the first part of the book, where I retrieve a lot of archives that have been forgotten. I mean, I got into this project first actually researching film societies. I mean, frankly, without the scattered and ephemeral archives of film societies, there would be no history of art cinema in India, because these are not archives that are housed in the National Film Archives of India in Pune. These are really books and journals and photographs that are lovingly nurtured by either individual film societies. So Suchitra, for example, in Bangalore has a very good collection, and then by individual cine club members. And I wanted to understand what films meant. And when I say films, I'm talking about a segment of people. I mean, you know, in the 80s, they would have numbered about a little over 100,000, which given India's population doesn't seem very large, but, you know, 100,000 members of film clubs, I think is a significant phenomenon. And I wanted to understand what films meant to them, like what kind of films they wanted to be watching. And the answer was non-Indian, non-Hollywood films, and why that was. And that got me into the relationship between films and civil social organizing in some ways. And I wanted to, as a historian, retrieve that history, which I think has been forgotten. So the second part of the book, or the first part of the book, really talks about the arrival of a certain category, art cinema in India, what aspirations were encrusted or accreted onto that category, in what ways this global category changes upon its arrival in India. And then, I mean, just when you think that the category is sort of acquiring stability, it explodes into all of these other things. I mean, you know, I was very curious, again, as a historian who takes an interest in conceptual history, I've always been very interested in the politics of naming. So when you look at the archives of Indian cinema in the 1960s, you're really struck by the names that are circulating for the same body of films. So it's art cinema, parallel cinema, political cinema, radical cinema, avant-garde cinema, middle cinema, even unpopular cinema. Chidananda Dasgupta actually calls it unpopular cinema. And, you know, my question was the Indian new cinema, Indian new wave. And my question was, well, what's going on with the politics, with so many names floating around? And clearly, you know, we say what's in a name? Well, a lot. And people are channeling all kinds of aspirations and energies into the category that they choose to name art cinema or new wave and so on and so forth. And I wanted to revisit those debates again. As a historian, revisit those debates, because I don't think that debates around film with such intensity have really been repeated in India, and analyze the consequences of that. So that was the second aspect of forgetting, or that the book analyzes. The third and most important in some ways, and is the fact that I'm at the second part of the book. For those of you who have read it, it's the second part of the book is about three very well-known filmmakers, certainly among among Indian cineasts, they're very, very well-known filmmakers, although I think how many of their films people devoted to Indian cinema have, I mean, I'm unsure about how rigorously their corpuses are still watched to this day. I mean, Ray certainly, maybe a little bit of Kathak, a little bit of Sen, but at least the names are known. So if they're so well known, then why do I say forgotten? I mean, in what sense might they be forgotten? And that, I think, is where the legacy of art cinema becomes really crucial for me, because as I say very early on in the book, this is not a biographical study, nor do I analyze all of their films, which taken together would be over 100. These figures interest me because they register in their city trilogies a certain sense of disorientation about the post-colonial present, which really resonated with me in terms of the times that we are experiencing. So I write actually in the book, if you'll permit me, I just want to read out a little bit from an early part of the book. I write, while critical literature often pits these figures as if they were counterpoints, I see them as each other's necessary counterparts. The three men engaged polemically with each other in print. They also dedicated essays and books to one another. In the ultimate analysis, they were united by their commitment to the cause of good films as a way to engage the post-colonial present and imagine different futures. Their trilogies led to fierce debates, especially within the ranks of film societies, but also without, about film's place in thinking about radical social change. Sen, Ghatak, and Ray thus appear in this book as historians working through a new medium, film. Their insights into the evolving uncertainties of the post-colonial condition are my primary interest. Those insights have kept this body of films alive for some of us. The various strategies of the films discussed here, deployed to document the manifold contradictions at the heart of the present they inhabited and critiqued, without succumbing to the lures of any grand historical resolution, have not lost their relevance. They speak to our own uncertain times, when various crises of planetary proportions leave us disoriented and unmoored from any emancipatory visions of the future, of human futures. Art cinema itself has become a cinematic practice of the past. But the films by Ray, Ghatak, and Sen have much to say to us about how one might devise strategies for narrating times that the writer Amitav Ghosh has described as the Great Derangement. And as I think about it, I think that the pressure in the post-colonial moment was obviously to think and be in ways that would change the world. Whereas I think with these filmmakers, there's an acknowledgement or the way in which they acknowledge the disorientation. It's almost, Camus made this statement, I think in 1957, where he said, the point is not so much to change the world as to keep the present one from unraveling. And I think that that's what spoke to me most about the ways in which certain aspects in the works of these filmmakers are forgotten. And those are the pasts that I wanted to discuss in the book, to see what imaginations of the future were buried in them. So that said, I'll just briefly say that the book then it's my effort to stage a conversation between film and history. And I think Prathama alluded to this. Historians all too often have gone to films, but more often than not as sources. And I take them to be embodiments of certain experiences of modernity. And to that extent, filmmakers as artists are undertaking what we might think of as a historiographical operation. So the book it's divided into two parts. The first part is a history of the category art cinema, where I talk about certain figures, certain sort of post-imperial figures like Mary Seton and their contribution in this discourse, the new cinema debates, and then of course a history of film societies. The second part of the book is really about the trilogies, when I argue that if the art cinema project is inextricably linked with a meditation on what constitutes good films, and how, in what ways might good films be related to the project of good citizen making. In the second part of the book, I argue that conjoining of good films with good citizen making, which is very much a kind of Nehruvian post-colonial developmental project, that gets, that relationship is severed. And once that relationship is severed, you have good films sort of left to itself. And with each filmmaker, in my instance, in my case, Ray Sen and Ghatak, there are different ways of configuring what the meaning of good cinema is and what its relationship would be to the post-colonial contemporary. So that's what I try to do in the second part of the book, where I read closely each one's trilogy. And again, let me conclude by just reading out a little from the epilogue, where again I return to this theme of disorientation. And I say that, of course, the art cinema I have discussed here was produced in times that were very different from the times we are passing through. But those times and ours have one striking commonality. They are both disorienting. The promise of capitalist prosperity has worn thin for us. The filmmakers, critics, and film society activists all felt disillusioned with the promise of national development. They worked out their own ways of negotiating such times. The art films leave us with roadmaps of the time they inhabited, where the realm of experience could no longer be a guide to the horizon of future expectations. We cannot, of course, live out those experiences. The past is indeed the past. But in retrospect, we can recognize in their work the pioneering labor of a certain kind that we also need today, the creation of historical sensibilities adequate to the challenges of disorienting times. It is in this sense that Indian art cinema constitutes for us an ongoing repertoire of resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rochona, for that immensely capacious, but also just very, very introspective, also, and the kind of complicating the temporality of the present for us, what you call heterotelic, you call the present heterotelic. And I really appreciated how you do the careful formalist work of really parsing this vast herb of these three giants of art cinema, in bringing to the fore how they might speak to the present, despite being a form that's in some ways there is a whole narrative of transitioning to a neoliberal global cinema movement in India through the new Bollywood and so on. And somehow, as if we've left that past behind, that really was what resonated with me when I finished the book. So thank you again for sharing insights from your work. And now our seminar is open to a conversation with our discussants, Aswin, Samhita, and with Rochona and Prathama. Prathama, we'd love to see you now. our guests do feel we really regret that we can't see all of you, but we can certainly see your names. So as we continue this conversation, please post your questions and comments in the two boxes, the chat and Q&A, and we will keep track of them and bring you into the conversation. Okay, so over to Aswin and Samhita.
Thank you, Debjani, and congratulations again, Rochona and Prathama, on these wonderful books. We've learned a lot from them, not only about the topics you deal with, but also about how to tell a story. In Rochona's case, among other things, I truly loved how you bring the world of film societies to life, among other things. And in Prathama's book, I really enjoyed how you recast mythical figures, someone like Chanakya, for example, in the now of political ideas and actions. And thank you also for these opening remarks that I think have provided us all with many threads of questions and ideas and conversation topics. But by way of a beginning, I thought we could focus on a turning point and an impasse that you both identify in your work, a post-subaltern studies phase, particularly in the disciplinary terrain of history during the 1990s. And the sense you write about that projects that provincialized European and Western concepts were also seeming to reach a certain limit. As you wrote, Prathama, the goal was for you to embark on the positive and experimental task of reassembling various histories, philosophies, and experiences. So perhaps you can begin, if you could both start by telling us a bit more about this. First, your own experience of recognizing that a shift was underway. And second, from your specific locations. And second, how you figured out your particular response to this large-scale disciplinary turn towards histories of the global South.
Thank you, Aswin. I think you have zeroed in on the kind of central drive of I think both Rochona's and my books, which is our inheritance of the subaltern studies from the subaltern studies moment and our move aside of it. So on my part, two things. One, I was trained in history writing by reading subaltern studies as at a moment when I was also doing traditional left politics on the ground. So many of us were part of left agitational movements in the 80s and 90s at very young age. And we were already, in some senses, facing the problem of why Marxist ideology cannot accommodate things like caste and gender in its. And at the same time, in the classroom, we were reading this new subaltern studies work coming out, which on the one hand, in its early moments with Ranajit Guha's manifesto, as it were, was still very much within the Marxist paradigm, and yet were kind of raising historiographical questions. And one of the early essays by Partha Chatterjee, for instance, was on caste, something that I think is returned to now, very late in life. While subaltern studies helped us overcome the challenges that we were finding in everyday politics on the ground, there were two things that, at least for me, were still to be resolved. One was this question that I raise in the book, which is, what is the political? The subaltern studies moment by saying that all forms of being of the subaltern is a priori political, in fact, presume that it always already knew what the political was. Its burden of argument was against those who were calling peasant and tribal and Dalit movements pre-political. But for us, we were still to truly get an answer to imagining alternative forms of the political. to recognizing the political otherwise. Two, I think, at least I personally, felt a little imprisoned in the disciplinary structure of history. In the sense that, which is why my first book, which was in fact a study of how not just historicism in the narrow sense of the term, but a diffused commonsensical historical sensibility often may disable creative play with time and imagining the future otherwise. Because in my perception, subaltern studies was, despite its historiographical novelty at that time, still deeply invested in the discipline of history. And I wanted, in some senses, to have one step out of that discipline. So I continue to be a historian. However, I do think that I am, quote unquote, post-subaltern studies. I mean, it's a move that is enabled by studying subaltern studies, but I think I am a bit of a renegade historian who works with historical materials and uses historical methods, but nevertheless is probably prone to speculative leaps. So that's where I am in terms of the subaltern studies relationship.
So, one of the things that I've said in the book, and I take your question to be sort of pushing at that, is that I make certain claims on behalf of the filmmakers as historians, as almost being, anticipating certain turns in radical historiography in India. And I'm going to bracket the question of pre and post and all of that, and just talk to the material. I mean, what I find fascinating, or what drew me to these figures, was that in the disciplinary history that I had been trained in, was still very caught up in the question of transition, and then of course critiquing that transitional moment. And I think what I found in their work was actually thinking with impasse. So thinking about post-colonial times as, with not so much, as I said earlier, not so much trying to change it as to struggle to not be defeated by it in some ways. And it's really as people who were thinking with and through an impasse. I mean, I invoke Jennifer Fay's work in my Ray chapter, and I talk about this feeling of present tenseness. That's the issue that I was trying to deal with, and I thought that that's something that as historians we have to think with. And it seemed to me that disciplinary history, whether in India or elsewhere, was not doing enough of that, because again, history is so, I think, as a discipline, vested with the question of transformation. And often I think we don't think enough through the question of attachment and impasse. And in fact, my colleague, my recently departed colleague, Lauren Berlant, I mean, her work has sort of been at the back of my head in helping us think through certain, the notion of attachments and the notion of impasse. And I wanted to bring it back to the historiography that I do, and see if there's going to be an uptake of that among historian colleagues. So I'm very, very interested in this, to see if this book can actually lead to an interdisciplinary conversation, which is happening in other fields. But I find historians remarkably resistant to thinking with the aesthetic.
Rochona, because you mentioned impasse and how important it is to your frame, the way you think of the relationship between post-colonial forgotten futures and the heterotelic present. Could you talk a little more of what you call an aesthetic political enterprise of slowness? You use the term slow, and you bring in other third cinema scholars into it. And I also wanted to point out something that really spoke to me about just the sparkling interdisciplinarity that we see in your book and Prathama's book, is your cite from Deleuze, where you actually, it speaks to everything, every step of what you've done, is that where interdisciplinarity does not begin when one discipline begins to reflect on another, but rather meaningful conversation happens when one discipline realizes that another has already posed a similar problem.
Right.
And so reaches out to the other to resolve this problem, but on its own terms and for its own terms. And so both, if you could speak to both the interdisciplinarity and the slowness in relation to impasse.
Okay, so there are two questions there. One is about the slowness, that stuff, and then this bit about interdisciplinarity. And I mean, there are people actually on this call, Monishita, Sangeeta, Gopal, who probably know much more about slow cinemas than I do. And let me again clarify, a lot of people have been writing about slow cinemas primarily as a move that is a decelerating move, if you will, at a time when capitalist frenzy is putting pressure on our capacity for attention. So, for example, Jean Ma's work on thinking about sleep and the relationship of sleep with cinema, it's very instructive. But in some ways, that's not what I'm doing. I was actually talking about a moment of developmental scarcity, where, and I have a citation there from an essay by Ritik Ghotok, where he's writing a review of Krakauer's book. And he actually says there, it's going to be hard to write about Krakauer's book in great detail, because many of the films that he mentions are not available to us. And that really stood out to me, where here was someone talking about the scarcity of things to watch. So that then raised this question of, well, how do we watch? How do we source? Sometimes you'll be watching things perhaps only for the only time in your life, and it requires a certain kind of attentiveness, which I think is very important to factor in. So, and that's why I invoke Isabel Hofmeier's work on Gandhi, where she's talking about, again, I mean, so there are
patient reading,
multiple citations there. Yeah, Hofmeier and patient reading, and she talks about Uday Mehta and his discussion of Gandhi. So it's really cultivating a kind of patience and respect to certain objects. In my case, they are films, as if you will never encounter them again. And often that happened, which is why the stories that Aswin referred to earlier are very important. Like, how did Nazarene pass through one part of Calcutta and people just went in there, and because they were so keen, and like what the traffic in films were, and so on. So, and that's the context in which I talk about slowness as an ethic and as part of a certain pedagogical practice. The second part, the citation that you gave from Deleuze, thank you for raising that, because the sentences that immediately follow were the ones you read. I said, so Deleuze writes, meaningful conversation happens when, quote, one discipline realizes that another has already posed a similar problem, and so reaches out to the other to resolve this problem, but on its own terms and for its own needs, unquote. And then I say, that is to say, it is not only about how society is reflected in these films. Rather, that relationship constitutes a response through the figures and formalistic affordances specific to films. this is what the trilogies demonstrate so powerfully. And if I may just illustrate that with an example, one of the things that happens in all the Mrinal Sen films that I discuss in my book, I mean, he uses, starting from Bhuvan Shom and right up to, so Bhuvan Shom interview Calcutta 71, he uses this footage that he was actually shooting on Calcutta streets at a time of tremendous political upheaval. I mean, that was the time that the student unrest and the Naxalite movement was at its height. So in many of his films, you see actually between 69 and 73, the same footage of police firings. You see women marching on the streets. And then he writes in one place that after Calcutta 71 released, there were people who kept returning to the theaters because they caught a glimpse of people who had disappeared, friends and relatives who had disappeared. And to me, that speaks of a remarkable coming together of, film and history. That often what is pro-filmic exceeds what is pro-filmic is also always contingent. And typically as historians, we try to put order into it. Whereas there's something about the medium of film that exceeds that capacity to put order into it. Do you see? And that's the way in which I was interested in sort of thinking interdisciplinary to see what historians could get from those formal capacities which are built into the medium.
I'll make some comments. I hope to try to bring the insights of these books together. I'll be as quick as I can with these sort of initial remarks because it seems like we have some questions coming in. So I'll turn it over to Aswin and then we'll take other questions from the rest of the group. As the genre of the kind of book talk invites, I just wanted to reiterate what a pleasure it was to read these books. Prathama, I admit that I'm resolutely guilty of working on the other full-on song dance cinema. So political theory, Vivekananda, Chanakya, I was like, oh no. But I found this book so fun. It was hilarious in moments. And I mean that as a compliment to it seems like you had a lot of fun writing this. There's that one moment in one of the earlier chapters where you referred to the Deshpande play where in the play that Chanakya has to complete his manuscript before any political success, which I was just thinking of book writing itself in this kind of meta way that I mean, it just seems like you really enjoyed writing this. Rochona too, in a way like Prathama, you're also writing about kind of very canonical figures, but it's reinvested with such sort of fresh eyes and looking at this moment. And I'm saying that especially to Rochona as one who has been sort of living, breathing this same time period, but I learned so much, almost even from scratch, about a lot of things to sort of look with fresh eyes at art cinema, at these films that I've seen before, to the extent that I think it's inviting a retrospective. I'm going to rewatch, I think, all of these films that you've written about. Rochona uses this very evocative term, apprehension, as a way of thinking historically about how these films and filmmakers apprehended their own presence, the uncertainties therein of the future. And so there's a kind of both understanding and anxiety that's intuited in, I think, this very evocative phrase. And part of that apprehension on the sort of anxiety side of that was this sense of a kind of lack of art cinema, or in Prathama's book, a kind of lack of political philosophy that I think, these come together in terms of you both reading these as being tied to kind of material conditions of the post-colonial, whether in Prathama's book, the idea that political modernity itself was so deeply embedded in the experience of being colonized, or in Rochona's book, the kind of scarcity that informed these vociferous debates, as well as a kind of love for cinema. Rather than resolving sort of these really kind of messy terrain of what politics is or what art cinema is, the stories that you tell reveal these debates stakes, again, about kind of post-colonial conditions, modernity, the political. And there's also this way in which you powerfully raise this question of where we turn to. So again, not merely provincializing Euro-American thought or histories, but understanding the weight of certain categories of thought, whether art cinema, politics. And there's this way in which you kind of model this, like Prathama turning to theater as a way of elucidating what the political is, or Rochona turning to cinema as a way of thinking of not only history itself, but the stakes of historiography. I guess two questions that I have. One for Prathama, this question of the non-political. This is a very presentist question, so I apologize, and maybe you can take this as an opportunity to respond in whatever way you want, which is that at this moment there are vociferous debates in India as well as elsewhere about the right to privacy. And underlying that, there seems to be an anxiety over there should be some space that kind of the law or governance is not intervening. So a kind of desire for some autonomy, I think definitely informed by the kind of media saturation and technological saturation and anxieties about surveillance. So often that question sort of seems to gesture in the direction of a desire for a non-political space, even as you acknowledge, as many feminist interventions have said, everything is political. There's definitely all of that. But I think this is an interesting question. And looking back from this, I think your book might actually offer some insights into thinking, again, how the political is often defined by this question of what is non-political or extra-political. And for Rochona, the question that I had was, there's a way you talk about art cinema as an aspirational category. And again, I know you're less interested in kind of defining X, Y, and Z equals art cinema. And indeed, there are so many terms that have been sort of thrown out. At the same time as there's a way in which historically these films have been viewed together, talked about together, discussed together. I was just curious, maybe also for my own benefit, because it's a question that I think about myself. What do you make of the fact that if sort of art cinema is aspirational, and you talk about this a little in the book, but maybe to expand on this here, many filmmakers who are making commercial films also very emphatically thought of their films as art. So in other words, the separation was maybe less internalized on a very kind of general scale. And anything that you would like to say about that, I welcome.
Okay, thanks, Samhita, and apologies for making you plod through all that political theory. So very often I am like so uncomfortable in my shoes. I mean, when I see Debjani, I want to say I want to be a literary theorist. And I want to be a media scholar. I mean, all the fun is there. I totally am with you on that. I have a large number of media scholar colleagues in my institution, and I incessantly read their stuff. And I read Aswin's stuff, and it's such an exciting domain. Having said that, two things. One, I am not sure whether the debate about the right to privacy, as it is panning out in India, is kind of connected to the question of carving out a non-political space. Quite the contrary, actually. The attempt is by the more, what should I say? It's an attempt by the more liberal middle-class sections of India trying to translate privacy as a political ideal. On the other hand, a large number of surveys have shown, especially post the what is called the Aadhaar in India, the kind of the unique identification number that all Indian citizens are now being ascribed, is that the working classes are in fact arguing very often quite the opposite, which is that they claim, or they demand rather, digital inclusion and are most willing to give up their own personal data to the national database on the ground that they have not been seen or heard earlier. In the print moment, where print was both for reading and writing inaccessible to large sections of the population, while the digital medium allows for a certain visibility in both the state's radar and in the internet in general. So it's actually quite a complicated situation that we have in India at this time. So, you know, but I wanted to kind of talk at a tangent for a moment in terms of my relationship with both media studies as such and with the question of the contemporary. And this connects to Rochona's book centrally in some ways. One of the biggest dilemmas, conceptual dilemmas that I face in my own work, and I continue to face this till date, is whether I should, I mean, I'm completely with Rochona on the point that historians tend to overlook the specificity of genre and medium and read every form of expression in the same way as sources for their content. On the other hand, there is another scholarship which is important and a big corrective to this historian's fallacy, which is to say that what we had called content earlier is in some senses determined by the media form. Or rather, it's the media form that enables and disables certain modes of thinking and being, which is very often called affordances, right, in today's academic term. And I am kind of pulled in between the two. In other words, I've learned a lot from print studies and cinema studies and now digital studies. However, I also sometimes feel that there is a certain secret transition narrative, to go back to what Rochona was saying, which kind of forces us to think of our contemporary in terms of this transition framework, which is to say that from the moment of print, which is the political philosophy of moment, to the moment of cinema, which is the affected aesthetic moment, to the moment of the digital, which is the kind of affordances moment, there is a kind of path that we have necessarily globally trod. So I'm like, you know, I want to have a certain fidelity to media and to embodiments and genres. At the same time, I also want to, emancipate thought at the cost of sounding like 19th century intellectual historians, thought from the medium or media determinism, to put it like. So I'm very unresolved about this question. So I'm just putting it out. But to me, it's important. I mean, something that was written in a Shastra or in a Tarikh in earlier times is not the same as it sounds when it is written in the in an essay or a novel, right? So the genre question is central, yet is there a way to cut across genres and media which is not abstract? Let me put it like that. Okay, so.
You would have noticed that I've enabled talking for the entire our entire group. We are just 22, 21 of us, and it's just that I didn't enable the video for everyone because I don't know if all of you want to be seen at the same time. It's your choice. But if you can put up your hand, I can just and unmute yourself. You can talk to our panelists. So do join the conversation. And meanwhile, to Rochona, if you want to respond to Samhita.
Well, very briefly, thank you, Samhita, for reading it so carefully. I mean, the term apprehension also really, it spoke to me, and it's I take it from from my colleague who Prathama knows, Lisa Wadeen's book, Authoritarian Apprehensions, where she uses the term in this threefold way of arrest, capture, but also a kind of fearful anticipation of a future to come. Going back to the question you asked about aspiration, though, absolutely. Not for a moment am I suggesting that aspiration is any one person or one group's monopoly. It's just, nor am I particularly invested in even the distinction or, the division. I recognize that it was there, the art mainstream, because there are many, they're leaky. And they're also, they're both leaky and sticky at the same time. I was interested in just thinking about this particular historical moment when neither, regardless of which film, what kind of filmmaker you were, this is not a state-supported cinema, whether we're talking about the industries in Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, or whether we're talking about, say, the FFC funded films, because again, these were loans given on interest, which filmmakers had to repay. So all filmmakers had a troubled relationship with the state. What interests me is their mode of address to that entity, and to the entity one calls the state, but also to something beyond that. Maybe this might be a good time to think about what role, if any, the global South is playing. Prathama spoke about it very eloquently today when she said it's a geopolitical non-space. Whereas, when I was thinking that for the filmmakers that I'm discussing, it would be anachronistic to use the expression global South, because in some ways it's a post-Cold War coinage. I think they were still working in the third worldist framework. But that said, there were a lot of South-South dialogues. But also some of these, so when you think about let's say the Latin American lot, oftentimes, they are channeled by, say, conversations with the Cine Regionali, the Italian or the French or American newsreel or Chris Marquez. So with notwithstanding all the criticisms of that one might have of, or not even criticisms, the exhaustion that one might feel with the projects of provincializing, the fact of the matter is we live in a post-imperial world where the question of empires, formal or informal, are very important. And it's, whether we call it D or post, whatever name we give it, I think the task of continuously pushing at those imperial legacies, not all of which we can wish away, remains. So I don't see how we can completely, bypass. I mean, so if Prathama said that I want to liberate thought from its mediatized expression, I'm not entirely sure how to completely be in the post. I'd love to be, but I just think that, history lingers. And even as we sort of address those historical legacies, we just have to keep at the task of critique. That wasn't very clear, but there you have it.
Can I jump in here with a couple of quick sort of points, and then we can open it up? I know Morishita Das has posed a question, and others have, I'm sure, too. Just very quickly, in response to what Prathama was saying, I'm glad you mentioned your interlocutors at CAS, that's the work going on, because as I was reading your book, it was clear that the conjuncture in which you were writing, that the fact that citizen making is what's been happening over the last 10 to 15 years, I just couldn't help going down the road of thinking, for example, that the 4 elements that you wrote about is being put into a very savvy remix, for instance, in a podcast like Modi's Man Ki Baat, where it's precisely the elements of selfhood, a sudden kind of conjuring of the people, the call to action that every podcast inevitably includes, and various ideas about the political and the popular that are being remixed in this moment, that I think, even though you were sort of pushing back against mediatizing this, I do think that your book has so much to say about our conjuncture now in terms of citizen making and people making projects. So I can see all sorts of productive ways in which media studies scholars will take up your book and move forward in interesting ways. But a couple of quick questions before we open things up. Rochona, what you just said about thinking through the global South, post-imperial histories, and so on, that brings me to one idea that Samhita and I were thinking through, which is the idea of a non-place, what Prathama calls a deterritorial intellectual domain, and so on. Both of your books do very creative things with the kinds of spatial links that you forge. You both encourage us to move past certain geographic provincialisms and bring into view other kinds of cross-regional maps and conversations. And Rochona, your book in particular does something really fascinating, which is it brings Kerala into the conversation. And I'm curious about the work that you did there, and if and how it pushed you to reconsider Bengal's position in discourses of art cinema. And perhaps it helps you provincialize Bengal itself a little bit more in media studies and cinema studies. And if a focus on Kerala opens up other trajectories for understanding the life of art cinema and its publics. I'd love to hear a bit more about your journey there, what you found, your encounters with archives and filmmakers and publics there.
Should I?
Please, yeah.
You respond? Okay. As I said, I began this work with film societies. And really, eventually I realized that what they were talking about is this category, art cinema. So it really began with film societies. And one of the first people I went and spoke to was Adur Gopalakrishnan. And because he'd set up this film cooperative. And one of the things that struck me again was the tremendous affection and respect with which somebody like Adur Gopalakrishnan, later on Girish Kasaravalli, who I went and also met, or eventually Cine Club members, would be talking about the tremendous affection and respect with which they talk about their Bengali counterparts. The kind of Bengal exhaustion that one experiences in South Asian history, I did not see when I was writing about safe, or when I was speaking with film society proponents. What's interesting also was, and this is something that came to me much later, I realized that during 1971 or around that time, there were actually people coming from East Bengal who worked for, say, Bangladesh Radio, and they were traveling through the country with West Bengalis onto other parts of the country, trying to take film society work back to what was going to become Bangladesh very soon as a new form of of civil social activism and organization. And it's not just Kerala, Aswin. I mean, the networks between, say, different places in Kerala, Karnataka, and certain, we won't call them small towns anymore, they're tier 2 metros, Agra, Jaipur, Jodhpur, Roorkee, Imphal. I mean, film societies were really throbbing and thriving, which is not to say that there were no hierarchies between them. I mean, in Kerala, it's almost like listening to a big family. I mean, if you speak with Adur, what they recount are all these fights with other societies, or they'll say that, oh, somebody like John Abraham became too much of a renegade. But I think there are more histories to be written about these other formations. So there would be a Bombay-based formation, for example, with your Said Mirza and Manikol and that lot, like the Padamsis. And so I think these are very robust artistic circuits, some of which, some practitioners in theaters, others in film. And it allows you to recalibrate how we think about the nation, the region, the province, the local. And all of them are, they in their self-conception, they're very cosmopolitan. I mean, they move between places and people much more freely than we do as disciplinary scholars. And I found that tremendously liberating. Thank you for the question.
And this might be a good segue into the two questions that Manishita has already posed in the chat window. But she has a question for Prathama, going back to your question of emancipating thought from media, and to follow up with some of Rochona's reflections on slowness and how it comes out of the form or the formal playfulness that you write about in relation to these filmmakers and others. Manishita, do you want to?
And Sangeeta has her hand up too. So after Manishita, we'll go with Sangeeta. Yeah.
Thank you for fascinating presentations and the discussion. My connection's not particularly reliable right now, so I'm not sure if you can hear me. But I was just wondering, I think I posted I should have, I think it's visible only to the host and the panelists, not to everyone. So my question for Prathama was, if you could talk a little bit more about what's at stake in your desire to cut across, to emancipate thought from the medium, as you put it very eloquently, and to cut across genres and media. And also a kind of related question to Rochona about, that sort of asks you to speak a little bit more about what focusing on the medium or paying attention to the medium or to medium specificity brings into your analysis. And especially, I thought apologize not having read the book yet, but your use of the terms an aesthetic of slowness in relation to these films suggested to me much longer, very interesting genealogy of the term as it is used now. Right. Mostly in relation to films of exploring the impasses of a post-Cold War world. So if we could speak a little bit to that.
Right. Thank you, Manishita. Actually, to put it in you put it in the way that I did, emancipate thought from media and genres. The moment we put it like that, it does sound problematic to me. I mean, that's exactly not, the reason why I say I'm so unresolved about this is I'm trying to work in a kind of in-between space where, let us say, I've not been a person who works with either his print studies or media studies or digital studies. Though I've immensely learned from those disciplines, or literary studies for that matter. I've learned this, that there is nothing called disembodied thought, that a thought has a particular embodiment and its efficacy and its charge derives from the way it is embodied. And yet, on the other hand, because I have worked in the field of, and whatever, I mean, all of these are rather, again, you know, there seems to be pretentious kind of rubrics, conceptual history or intellectual history or, you know, history of thought and practice, in which there is a certain, I'm trying to capture something which is both embodied and yet beyond its mediated form. The question for me in that sense, I mean, of course, the question of genre and the question of medium are different questions, and I do not want to confuse the two. For the moment, however, what I'm trying to get at is, how do I write of possibilities of thought and action which are in some ways irrespective? So the question, I mean, I completely agree with Aswin in terms of what he's saying, but the question that I have in my mind is Modi possible without the digital moment? Or is Modi necessarily reducible to the digital moment? That's the dilemma that I am in some senses stuck in. And it can apply to the question of the, you know, all the work that has happened on print in the 18th, 19th century for South Asia, or the mid-20th century cinema studies question. That's the thing that I'm struggling with. Now, in that context, when I go back to what I've learned from, you know, literary scholars and their incredibly rich debate on translation, the question of whether talking in a kind of under the rubric of global South or under the rubric of transmedia or transgeneric modes of being, does the concept of translation help us? Not just across languages, but also across media and genres. In other words, is there a way of not just meaning making across these, but, you know, transmission of affect and transmission of, you know, potentialities across these? Can that be thought under the rubric of translation? I mean, maybe Debjani can come back on this. Or are we looking at something else when we have to think across media and across genres? What is the larger hermeneutic rubric of exchange or transaction that one has? I'm sounding awfully abstract, but I hope I'm being able to get at what I'm trying to say. Sorry.
Oh, thanks.
I'll just stop here.
Yeah. So Rochona, do you want to respond to Manishita?
Very briefly, Manishita, thank you for the question. And all I was trying to suggest, and I think I've mentioned this briefly earlier, that you're absolutely right, that typically we talk about slow cinema in the context of late capitalism. And all that I was trying to offer here was a different genealogy of slow cinemas by rooting it in the context of post-colonial scarcity and, you know, in the time of developmental modernization. I mean, one statistic, for example, that struck me when I was doing this research was, as you know, the first art house theater that we have is, or one of the first art house theaters is Nondam, which came up in 1985. In 1963, there was something like 483 art house theaters in the US. So it's really in the context of such wild discrepancies. What did it mean to acquire, source, watch, sometimes not even in theaters, in people's houses or on fields? Like what kind of, how do we think about the cinematic enterprise? And there I thought the ethic and aesthetic of slowness was a useful way to think about it. but I can't wait for you to read the book. You're its ideal reader in some ways. Thank you.
So we have Sangeeta. Do you want to just ask your question about the speculative and anything else to our speakers?
Thank you so much. This was really amazing. It's a fantastic discussion, and I that was just a comment, but I do have maybe a couple more comments that I'll just indulge. So thank you very much, Prathama. I read your book. I'm writing a book right now on late 70s, 80s sort of feminist movement in women filmmakers. And I have to say that in the spirit of your last comment on translation, what I found to be so productive about your book was in fact this breaking up of the the disaggregation of the political, right? Which at that very moment when that everything is political is the framework through which we have seen this decade and feminist work in this decade. Applying the insights of your book like really shed an entirely different light on some of the archives that I was looking at. So this is just by way of saying that it was really productive to unthink the everything is political being the kind of main intervention of feminism and try to maybe parse it out in some of the ways that you suggested that became really productive for me. And I'm still kind of thinking through that. So, the application of those elementary aspects, especially to social movements, is something that I hope maybe if you've had any thoughts about that, I would love to hear more. And the kind of cultural expressions that connect with those social movements, so that's sort of really interesting. And Rochona, you and I have talked often about this, but I feel like for me, one of the main contributions of your book, which I also haven't read in its totality, but I've had the pleasure of reading parts of, is precisely the way that you really put pressure on a certain mode of Indian cinema historiography that thinks the moment of disaggregation, right, the sort of 70s or whatever, through generic categories like popular film and art film, right? And you really force us to take another look at that. And the way you do so is quite interesting because, in fact, if I may somewhat crudely summarize, the idea has been that art cinema is more reflective versus the popular cinema sort of, in a haphazard manner captures those that moment of disaggregation and doesn't have a futurity, right, in the sense that you're describing. And yet, like in your readings of these art filmmakers, and even the instability around the term art cinema and all these various ways to name it, is also really capturing all the anxieties of naming and categorization that surround that whole era in Indian history, right? Like that's not just there, it's everywhere. How to think fracturing polity, among other things. So I was just wondering whether you felt that taken together, the three filmmakers that comprise your second half, and then all the kind of multiplicity of film societies that comprise your first, or at least aspects of your first, you kind of think that the book as a whole can say a bit about, I don't know, about just the way that the how do I put this? That the way that multiplicity arrives at that moment. And that seems to have kept going, you know what I mean? Despite all our attempts to recategorize it into emergency, post-emergency, et cetera, and so on and on. Yeah, I realize that's not a question, but just a invitation to speculate a bit on art cinema's legacies of multiplicity. This is what has always impressed me about art film, actually. As you know, like Samhita, I work on the song dance film, or I did. And that seems to be such a fertile area of multiplicity. I'm also interested in what you have found to be the multiplicity of that other film.
Thanks a lot, Sangeeta. I really do not have a very precise answer. I mean, thank you very much for reading the book closely and for drawing things out of it for your own work. The way that let me say what I was doing in the book. Maybe that will be a kind of perhaps less than adequate response to what you're asking. So one of the things that I was trying to do in the book, and of course, quote unquote, women and gender figure in the book at multiple points without my actually writing either a chapter or a particular section on women or gender. In other words, what I was trying to get at is the question of not who the political subject is, which is time and again contingently perhaps a woman or the queer or whatever you may call it, but it's in the structuring of the figure of the political subject that I was interested in, and in its staging. And in that, I would say, again, tentatively, that I would not think of women's movement or feminist movement in India of the 1970s and 60s as a social movement. Because I have a problem with the epithet, quote unquote, social. And I think it in some senses misunderstands what was happening at that moment. At that moment, two things were happening, and correct me if I'm wrong, was one, a complete implosion of the idea of society. In other words, when women were saying that, the Dalit woman or the upper caste, middle caste woman were not the same, or that, so it's a question about the who that was being raised. At the same time, the women's movement was torn between approaching the state and its lawmaking legislative capacity as the prime agent of quote unquote social change. And on the other hand, questioning what is called the family. Society or the social fell through the cracks in that debate, in my imagination. And it was the interface between the state and the household that was being put up for questioning. So I would think that it's not a social movement question in my imagination. So I will just stop there for the moment. And in terms of the cultural expressions of social, I'm just saying that, so is it possible to say that economic right, I mean, this is something that I struggle with in one of the chapters. Is it possible to say that what we recognize as economic writing is gendered? So the question of expression stumbles at that moment. So the question to me is not what women were writing and doing so much as whether dominant modes of expression, such as planning or the economy, could have been or would have been possibly gendered in certain ways. So that was the question that I was struggling with in some senses. But I do see where you and I kind of meet in kind of raising the question of this, whether the social is the apt category to subsume the question of women's movement in 70s, 80s India.
Rochona, do you want to respond?
No, Rajiv was with us.
She was.
I was just going to say that Rajiv just left, but it would have been so interesting to get her voice in on this particular
Absolutely.
issue
I was
of
just
how
thinking
to
of
think
her.
about yeah, because I mean, she has such interesting things to say about liberal feminism and it's radical feminism and liberal feminism and the role of the state and that particular historic moment of the women's movement. But Sangeeta, this question of art cinema's legacies, I'm going to invoke the work of another of our senior colleagues, Ashish Rajathyaksh. And I just finished reading his newest book manuscript, which actually his starting point in the book is the strike at FTII that happened in the very long strike that happened in 2015. And I mean, in some ways, the book is actually bookended by Jadavpur's cholera, the FTII strike, and then the Jamia strike, or the Jamia, the violence against Jamia students by the state. And he makes some very interesting points about how to map digital India onto these, or to tell a sort of parallel story of digital India together with the history of these strikes. But what sort of leaped out at me was one of the slogans during the strike, which was Eisenstein, Puravkin, we shall fight, we shall win. And Ashish says that he doesn't know when the slogan was, when it was founded, but and actually the title of his book, and I hope he doesn't kill me for saying this, it's actually called John Ghatak Tarkovsky. And again, it's taking from the strikers. And, I think that's where you investigate the legacies of art cinema, because surely, I mean, students on Indian campuses who are watching this body of, many of the films that I write about in my book, but also it's an ever expanding canon. And what are the meanings that they put on to this body of films? Surely the meanings have not remained stable. And yet there is something about the core of films. I mean, I found that slogan fascinating that it should be used during one of the longest strikes in an institution which doesn't actually have such a big history of striking. But it was happening all around when, what's his name, the fellow who played Yudhishthir was appointed as the director of FTI. Rajendra Chauhan, yeah, and so that's when the strike begins. But the names that are invoked there, John Ghatak, John Abraham, Tarkovsky, and then of course this Eisenstein, Puravkin. But I just wanted to throw that out in the context of thinking of art cinema's legacies. But thank you. This will be a topic of ongoing conversation with you, I'm sure.
Thanks, Sangeeta. Geeta has a question. Hi, Geeta.
Hi, I have to apologize because I've been, as several people know on this link, that I've been really ill. So, I mean, I've just touched your books and they're sitting in my pile of reading when I get better, but this was an incredibly productive conversation. And as you know, I love both your work. So I have a question, a comment and sort of an avenue for discussion, because as you know, I work on translation extensively and translation theory coming out of Urdu, right? Not necessarily coming out of just a simple notion of Anglophone exchanges. So one of the things I love about what both of you are trying to do is what I think of as speculative contra canonization. I wanted to, and it's helping me understand a little bit, because that's something I've been engaged with, certainly with the Progressive Writers Association at different stages of its being. But you opened it up in really productive ways for me. So I wanted to sort of open up the speculative to something that is, sort of thinks it through a form of, if you will, the economic. And this ties into Modi's, what I think, the stuff I've sort of written about with Modi, but also, teaching Irfan Habib's work and Lakshmi Subramanian's work recently. And that's in some ways the Muddati Hundi, right? The promissory note that has a timestamp on it. And it seems to me that one of the things that Modi's doing, and by the way, I mean, many of you know this, the digital work by the VHP started certainly in the 1990s. You know, as they started digital politics in the 1990s in a very kind of problematic and open-ended way. But so I wanted to take this form of the speculative and then have a comment on the social. And I wanted to take this notion of the speculative, have you think it, because both of you are actually opening up the question of speculative temporality, forgotten futures, you know, futures in multiple ways for us. So to think with it in different ways, and then the other to think about something that happened that you know about in Bengal and continued to happen with quote unquote art cinema, which is Pan-Asianism as a political and aesthetic project. So did you engage with it? If you did, how, and this, I mean, certainly Urdu in the 1920s translated a bunch of poetry from Japan, for example, but it came out of the work that was done, starting, as you know, in the late 19th century, with various artists, working with artists in Calcutta and political, and people who organize questions, if you will, because I'm staying with the sort of contra-canonization forms that you've opened up for us, Prathama. So that's so I want to think about that, and then think about those. I mean, one of the things about Pan-Asianism that I noticed was the idea, a lot of those conversations produced, certainly in Urdu, the possibility of pasts that didn't hold to forms of canonization in the ways that you're opening so productively for us, Prathama. So can we think with that? The other thing I wanted to say is what's interesting about the social, and I'm thinking particularly in the way US movements that I've been involved with since the 1970s actually turned to social constructionism, which is a very particular 1950s McCarthy-based project. And it's a way of eluding, if you will, you know, and again, it's political in quotation marks, and partly some of the work of the radical feminists in the 1970s that I was involved with actually return, and it's not political economy, it's social constructionism, right? So the social then gets evacuated of everything else in the ways in which you ask questions. Both of you, I think, ask questions about. So, you know, so is there a sense for you of thinking through that particular McCarthyist bent in, you know, that still inflects intellectual formations in the US and then is trafficked around the globe in different ways? Does that make sense?
It indeed does. It's an incredibly complex and rich set of questions, and I don't know how to give an adequate kind of response to it. Let me first quickly speak to, I think Rochona will have much more to say on this, about Pan-Asianism, for instance, and the question of social engineering. That would be the word that would be used in those times, the McCarthy times, and in some senses continues to be used today. But let me just respond to the question of speculation in both spatial and temporal terms. One of the things that I have learned from the scholarship that has worked, let us say, on connected histories or Pan-Asianisms or Indian Ocean or ocean studies or Atlantic studies is the fact that unlike what we imagine regions to be, we have had actually what can be called thought circuits and thought regions, networks of movement of artifacts and ideas in actual historical ways. across the Middle East and South Asia, across South Asia and Southeast Asia, across East Africa and West India, and so on and so forth. And I absolutely confess that I have never adequately been able to fully grasp that incredible geography of moving thought, which some historians, Lakshmi Subramaniam herself, as you mentioned, but so many others now. I mean, Sunil Amrit's work is so fantastic on the South Asia, Southeast Asia connections. I've learned a lot from it, but I've really not been able to make that transition into that spatial scale. At the same time, I am also interested, and here is where the speculative in the spatial terms comes in. I'm also interested in potential connections which have not happened historically. In other words, I am also trying to get at possible resonances across traditions and across thought systems which do not have a precedence of actually talking to each other. So is that possible to do beyond the connected histories moment? So that's one interest that I have. In terms of the temporal question, and that is really at the crux of both Rochna's and my book, which is the idea of speculation, not in terms that we understand within the framework of political economy, which is the ability to assign value in the present to a future which is unpredictable, which is where questions of actualization or options in futures work, but speculation in the sense of possible futures that do not have a history or that do not have an established past, or that have, as Rochona so poignantly says, a forgotten future which is only restricted to a past. In other words, where thinking temporally requires a certain out-of-jointedness with the present and with the historicity of the present, where speculation is a leap of faith beyond evidence and beyond the possibility of monetization and valuation, as it were. I'm not sure whether this truly really responds to what you're saying, but just thinking with you and,
Yeah, that's fabulous, actually, and really productive. Sorry, yeah.
Rochona, do you have any? We are coming close to the hour now. So do you have any?
I'm so thrilled that you were able to come, Geeta. No, Prathama actually said what I was going to say, that it's in using the expression forgotten futures, I think I'm also marking a distance from futures thinking in terms of insurance risk, as Prathama, you said, actuarial thought. And that goes to the question, I guess, I don't know how to respond to the issue of Pan-Asianism, Geeta, because there's a certain imagination in, say, particularly, let's stay with Mrinal Sen for the moment. I mean, his films are full of these, these shots where he brings together Biafran revolutionaries with students in Kolkata, with shots of Vietnamese peasants, certain shots of, let's say, Latin American agitators. There's Che. Now, what name do we give it? It's not, if we associate globalization with a particular stage of capitalist development, it's certainly not that. It's a certain internationalism. That's the word that Sen would have gone with. And maybe it's time to, to bring that back. Or, I mean, one could say, at the end of the book, I invoke the planetary, but with the proviso that it's become incredibly polysemic. I mean, some people will say planetary as understood, say, as a legacy of Earth system science. Others will say, like Spivak, that, oh, the planet is what overrides the globe. Still others, I mean, your colleagues, Ian Bauckham, Achille Mbembe, have yet other understandings of the planetary. So I think there is definitely an outward looking imagination there, which sees connections with other parts of the world. And all too often they are sporadic, incomplete, not completely worked out connections. How we name it, I think will have to be seen. And as always, your comments are so rich. I'll take them with me. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah. So I just wanted to say, actually, I mean, I know I'm married to her, but Kat's actually been working with this and has been publishing stuff on the planetary, but working with indigenous communities in different constituencies. So actually, in some ways, I'm thinking through in a very different trajectory that Ben Achille or Ian does. So, you know, just, so it's been, so I'm glad you brought it up and you know, that it's something you're thinking with. And you're right, that's the heart of what you're trying to do, which is contra-canonization, right? So it's interesting to think about. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you, Geeta. Well, you know, from the postcolonial global planetary without thinking in terms of a transition discourse is just one of the most generative ways in which we can, I guess, reconstellate what we think of as South Asia as a site for knowledge practices and sites of affective psychic investments in art forms. So please join me in thanking Prathama and Rochona and Aswin and Samhita for a most wonderful, enjoyable, generative discussion. We can never exhaust India, South Asia. That's the exciting thing about the region. We all have an investment and a deep attachment to, but we really hope to have another opportunity or other opportunities to continue our conversation. Okay, so thank you very much. And see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Fabulous.